and then on this z-axis we have time. Scroll bars.
Part 3.
Yeah. So if we bring this down into like Mike's noise floor, you'll see what I was talking about now. So here we're kind of around the noise floor of the system where you see everything kind of getting fairly even, but then you'll notice in those low frequencies it's nothing but just a big blue blob. That's because it's minimum phase, and so basically when it's really, really high like that, it's also going to ring really loud. So let's try this again. And if we EQ'd that flat, you'd see that would go away.
Which it was flat, I boosted the hell out of the...
Yeah, this is what he likes, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just...
It's everyone's preference.
So that's a lot better. It's not quite loud enough, but that's okay. We can work with this like that. Let's see what happens. So we're going to go ahead and smooth this.
Do you want to do one more? I'll turn up the volume.
Sure.
Yeah, it'll only take a second.
And the reason to turn it up is you're trying to overcome ambient noise. I might go a little more. Do you want to go to like maybe even 20 even? Oh, that's fine. Yeah. Let's try one more. Here we go.
Where are we at? Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're a good level. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to smooth this. Why are we going to smooth this? Well, I know everybody makes big deals about looking at graphs that are unsmooth so you can see everything, except for you saw that. There is nothing useful to see there at the high frequencies. It's just a bunch of noise. It's too hard to interpret. And at the low frequencies, yeah, sure, you can read and interpret that, but you'll notice when we add the smoothing, it doesn't really change things in such a drastic way. So it's not a big deal to add some smoothing. You just don't want to add like 1/3 smoothing, make it so smooth that when you're looking at it, it looks perfect, and in fact, it's hiding some things that are going on. So we're going to go ahead and go with 1/12, because you'll see the shape really didn't change. We're not hiding anything at this point, but we can start to make sense of what we're seeing. So there's a couple of things to notice with this alone. Anybody who's seen measurements of the Titans that were done using a gated measurement that is essentially like an anechoic measurement, you'll know it was like ruler flat. And then you see this and you'll say, that's not ruler flat, what's going on? The high frequencies are rolling off. We've got all this, jags and bumps
Peaks
up there.
and rolls and
everything. So what is that? Well, that's the room. That's exactly what happens when you stick a speaker behind a screen in a room and you've got things for it to reflect off of, diffract off of, you name it. So even with the best equalization and the best, most sophisticated DSP, there's always going to be problems like this. This is normal. So if you see that, don't think there's something wrong. That's actually pretty normal. And as long as what you see is a general kind of flat-looking response, then you can be pretty assured that you're doing okay. Where you want to start looking at things and saying, I think there might be a problem, or there might be something to work on, is you'll see, like, for instance, at 350 hertz, there's a little bit of a dip. At 229 hertz, there's another little bit of a dip. At 112 hertz or so, there's a peak instead, right? So you see what I mean. There's these little areas where it's a little off flat. And you could look at those, especially at these lower frequencies, and they can be things you might be able to correct. So how do you decide what you can correct? The shorter frequency. If it is above the point of the transition in the room where it's not minimum phase, if you start applying a lot of EQ using a standard minimum phase style EQ, like a PEQ, such as what the Mini DSP offers as standard for users to control, then it'll be flat where you measure it and nowhere else, and you're going to mess up the phase as well. If instead you take a measurement like we just did and look below only, in Mike's room it looks like probably somewhere in the, I'd say, 100 hertz range or so and below, between 100 and 200 hertz and below is where his transition probably is. We actually could calculate that if we wanted to. That's where you start to decide what you can work on. And the one thing you want to focus on is not these dips, because the problem with dips is that because it's being caused by wave cancellation, if you start to apply a lot of boost, it's going to take a significant amount of boost to actually fix that. It's actually not that audible. but what you're going to end up doing is clipping your amplifier. So earlier when Matt was testing out his speakers, he had a lot of boost on the bass. And that's a 1,000-watt amplifier, and at about 105 decibels, he managed to actually clip that amplifier. So 105 is loud, but it's not that loud, and that was 1,000 watts. Why? Because of that. So that's exactly why you don't want to put a lot of boost in your subwoofers to get rid of dips, because you're going to end up basically wasting a ton of power on something you probably can't hear anyway. Alright, so I'll show you distortion, but I'll just say for the sake of argument, I don't find these useful to look at, and in fact you'll see those are really high. It's not going to tell you anything about the room. Instead, what we want to look at are things like the RT60. So the first thing we need to do is actually get the limits of this to a range that makes sense. So 5 hertz is way below where it measures, so we're going to go ahead and stop it at 60 hertz, but we're going to go up to 20,000. So your number's better than you thought. So there's a whole bunch of different numbers here, and I bet you guys are probably thinking, like, what are all these options? What do they mean? They're all technically measuring the same thing in a different way. So the one that I recommend you using most of the time is this one that says TOPT. EDT, we don't need to use, and T20. Those are the two that I would look at the most. And the reason for that is in most rooms, T20 is measuring what the RT60 would be like, but based only on 20 decibels of decay. And that's because in most rooms, if you actually tried to measure down 60 decibels of decay, you'd be hitting noise, you wouldn't be able to make sense of that. So what it does is it just estimates it. The TOPT is just a little bit smarter way of doing essentially the same thing, of estimating what it should be. Now, there's numbers that are considered sort of standard numbers that you want to use for this. There aren't great hard and fast rules, and there's a great deal of argument about this. Here's what I'm going to say. Calculations are based on a reverberant field. So a calculation, meaning a prediction of the RT60, would not be accurate for this room. The direct measurement of decay is measuring something meaningful. And so while it may not have the exact meaning of what RT60 was intended to be, it's still a real measurement that has meaning. And a good number that's recommended based on some standards is that it should fall between 0.2 and 0.4 seconds, or 200 and 400 milliseconds. And you'll see that Mike's actually is really good. It falls right around the 0.2 line, actually falls below that. It's fairly flat. There's not, I mean, that little dip isn't a big deal. And then by 100 hertz, he's still around 0.35. So he actually has, with like all this stuff in here, pretty good bass absorption too. So the next thing we're going to look at is clarity. So this is another thing that falls into the category of there aren't good, these were not designed for home theaters, but that doesn't mean that they're not meaningful numbers to look at. They were designed for performance spaces. So you can't use the standards that you would see published online for these. So I'm going to go through these separately. So first we're going to look at D50. So D50 is based on the percentage of energy in the first 50 milliseconds relative to after that point is a measure of clarity. It's like kind of the ability to hear things cleanly, the voice clarity, the ability to separate the different instruments from each other. And 100% would mean everything is just perfect. And 0% would mean everything is just terrible. And so you'll see the y-axis on the right here is what we're looking at, that he's hovering right around 100% over most of the range down to 60 hertz. So that's a good number. I don't typically interpret these actually past the Schroeder frequency, but his number actually looks good anyway, so we'll pretend like it's meaningful. So C80 is a similar kind of concept. It's the first 80 milliseconds as a ratio over the next rest of the time. And so you'll see, and what that would be, so in a performance space, you're looking for like 2 to 3 dBs more in the first 80 milliseconds versus later. In this case, you would actually expect, because of a home theater's much greater decay, the greater amount of absorption, that the number would be much higher, and so sure enough it is. So a good number, I would say anything in the teens and above is a good number. As I said, there's no standard for this because it wasn't designed for home theaters, but just based on what I've seen and what seems to be rooms that sound good, what they look like, I like to see that number in the teens or above. If you can get it into the 20s, that's all the better. C50 is another version of the same kind of number. It's just based on the first 50 milliseconds, and so that number would typically be lower than C80. But same thing, if you can get that into the teens, that's a pretty good number. If you can get it higher than that, all the better. There's a certain point where you're going to dry out a room so much that you might get a really high number for that, and it may not actually be a great sounding room. All right, so we're going to go ahead and look at the waterfall, because those are more fun. So you'll see I had to generate a waterfall to do that. We're going to go ahead and change the limits on this one, because so we're going to do, I think, 30 decibels for the bottom end, because I think that's near his noise floor. I think we're going to maybe go with 100. Let's see what we get with this. And then we're going to go from 5 hertz to, we don't need to go all the way up to 20 kilohertz. So you really only need to, oh, I'm sorry, that didn't make any sense. 10 hertz. And we're going to probably only look up to about 300 hertz. So, you probably don't have to worry about that, but thank you. So here we've got a waterfall plot, and I had made a point earlier, when you get into the minimum phase range, when the sound, the amplitude level is higher, you will also tend to see this sign of ringing like this. So, as an example, if you apply an EQ filter to bring that down, you're going to see the ringing go down too. It is not 100% perfect. There are situations well below the shorter frequency where something actually isn't acting minimum phase, and doing that doesn't work. There's a reason for acoustic panels. I mean, they're necessary, so I'm not trying to say that EQ is the absolute answer in the steady state region of the frequency response, but the point is that when you have a really tilted response like Mike had, you are expected to see this kind of high amount of energy below 20 hertz. The thing is, we aren't very sensitive to sound down there, so when you see something like Mike's, I really wouldn't worry about it. I mean, it's just not an area that's going to have a big problem. I wouldn't try to bass trap 10 hertz. That would require massive bass traps, and you probably won't hear it. Instead, what you want to look at is really in that kind of meat and potatoes range that's going to be really probably 30 hertz up to, as I said, about 200-300 hertz, because that's in the range that we would call the steady state through transition area. And so here you can see that there's a couple signs of some modes in his room, and you can identify modes by this. When you see a peak in the response that continues all the way down like that, or like this one, that's reflective of a peak being caused by a mode, and that's ringing that you're seeing. And so you can see in some other places where there's like a little bit of that seems to actually decay down into nothing, and so in this case these may not line up with modes. Now, one way that you can actually assess whether this is associated with modes or not is that you can actually go ahead and put into REW the dimensions of the room, and if I knew the dimensions of Mike's rooms, I would do that. And then it'll give you lines at the different modes, and you can line those up with your peaks and dips and try to figure out what's associated with what. But the nice thing is when you see these peaks, and he actually has a relatively flat response, so we're not seeing anything all that horrible. But when you see these peaks and you see them ringing like some of them do, again, if you bring them down with a PEQ filter, especially when you're below 100 hertz or so in a room like Mike's, you'll actually be able to reduce that ringing. So his waterfall plot looks pretty good. This is actually, I would call this a decent looking waterfall plot. I'd be happy with this. I would just say look at the stuff below 20 hertz. If you saw something like that, but higher up in your room, that's a sign you've got a ringing problem you need to address. So some people also like to look at the spectrogram. It's really the same information plotted a different way, but I'm going to go ahead and put this up for you guys anyway. Let's do this, 10 to 200. So here you'll see there's not any real hot spots. It's decaying kind of evenly. Like I said, same information, and you'll see that in the area below 20 hertz where he was really hot, there's more energy showing up. So that's basically what that's showing you. So I guess, is there any questions?
I got a question about the